Yeah, baby. We are back. We are back here on WLTH 1370M. That is 92.7 in the FM dial. That voice you heard there was Dr. Anthony Fauci. Oh, and before we get started on this particular segment, let me just say, anybody who's going to the beach, beware. Okay, beware of severe weather. There's a beach hazard out there for this entire weekend. There's high wave action and dangerous currents expected at Lake Michigan. Waves of up to 9 feet are expected. 9 feet. This starts from Saturday morning through Monday morning. Swimming conditions will be life-threatening. So if anybody you know is going to the beach, warn them that swimming conditions will be life-threatening this entire weekend. Remain out of the water to avoid dangerous swimming conditions, and do not venture out onto the piers, jetties, breakwalls, or shoreline structures. That is for the entire Lake Michigan area here in our region here, the Chicagoland region. All right, folks, let's get to it. Now, you know, again, since 2020, I've been covering COVID as a phenomenon. It's probably the most important phenomenon of our lifetimes. I mean, when I think about the biggest events, biggest events of my lifetime, whether it was 9/11 or it was Lynn Bias dying and the sort of war on drugs that came after that, the O.J. Simpson trial and the L.A. riots and these types of things, Hurricane Katrina, the war in Iraq, you know, Trump being elected president, Obama being elected president, these types of events, I would argue COVID is probably the biggest of all of those events. It has affected us politically, it's affected us culturally, socially, economically, mentally. Even I, at the beginning of the pandemic, had no idea how much COVID would permanently change all of our lives and make such drastic changes to our society. But here we are, and the person who was put in charge to sort of help us navigate through all of it was one Tony Fauci. And he appeared before the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee on Wednesday after the release of his new diary, which he apparently was keeping on a laptop owned by the federal government. I don't know why he would do that, but hey, I always wonder why these politicians, like, if you got a government issued anything, why in the hell would I say anything that might make me look bad on it? But hey. His laptop was owned by the federal government, and it was basically talked about in a hearing chaired by Rand Paul, who has been really one of the few people in power really holding Dr. Fauci's feet to the flame and holding him accountable for the mismanagement of this crisis. The hearing actually centered on Dr. Fauci's role during the COVID pandemic, including the origins of the virus, the gain of function research that the NIAID was doing that Fauci claimed they weren't doing, but now we have proof that they actually were doing, and prior congressional testimony. As you heard, he just invoked the Fifth Amendment over and over and over again, rather than answering any questions, substantive questions. He exercised his constitutional right against self-incrimination in response to more than 100 questions. I believe it was 111 questions he pled the fifth to. Before questioning began, Fauci said that he believed that the hearing was intended to build a criminal case against him rather than conduct a neutral fact-finding inquiry, which is strange considering that Joe Biden gave him a blanket pardon for everything he did when he left office. So I don't understand what the issue is, other than not wanting to be held accountable. He's not going to jail. Nothing's going to happen to Dr. Fauci. Like I said, Joe Biden gave him a blanket pardon for everything. So why don't you just want to answer questions? Simple questions. Rand Paul actually threatened contempt proceedings and argued that Dr. Fauci should not be permitted to refuse to answer, and announced that committee plans to vote next week on whether to recommend holding him in contempt. Whether such a move would ultimately succeed, we don't know. We don't know. We do know that, like all of his other trips to Congress, that this hearing was extremely contentious. You know, the sad thing is that this has become politicized. You know, it's become the Republicans versus Fauci, when it should be anybody of good conscience versus Fauci, because I don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, leftist, rightist, centrist, independent, whatever, we all had our lives upended by COVID. I remember how traumatic COVID was for me as an adult. I can only imagine how kids who were kept out of school for months due to this pandemic were handling it. So the Republicans were criticizing Fauci's handling of this pandemic with the COVID restrictions and what they described as inconsistencies surrounding gain-of-function research and lab leak hypothesis. The Democrats argued that the hearing was politically motivated and defended Fauci's scientific record, saying that the Republicans had already reached their conclusions before the hearing began. And again, that's the sad part. Everything is culture wars now in our country. Everything. I can't even enjoy the WNBA. Can't even watch basketball because the liberals and the conservatives keep fighting over Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese and, you know, Paige Beckers or whoever. Everything has gone beyond just surface level disagreements. Everything goes back to the culture wars. And believe me, as somebody who studied history of this country, I personally believe a lot of that is done on purpose. I talk about this relatively often on this show, but the culture war that liberals and conservatives fight is really to keep us from coalescing around a class war for working class and poor people. And so now COVID is culture war. The Democrats feel obligated to defend Fauci no matter what the evidence says. And the Republicans, even though in this instance they are right to be very skeptical, but it's become, hating Fauci has become an article of faith for them as well. And so even if you're right to not like what somebody did, if you have a completely biased way of prosecuting it and dealing with it, then you just look like a fool at the end of the day yourself. So here we are. This has become just a culture war, another culture war brush fire. Now, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Paul, because Rand Paul is a doctor as well, he's an ophthalmologist, they would actually end up clashing a lot over Fauci's personal diary. Fauci accused Dr. Paul of conducting an obsessive vendetta and criticized the senator for releasing an unredacted version of his pandemic-era diary. But his pandemic-era diary was on our taxpayers' paid laptop. We paid for that. That's our stuff. You're a public servant. We have a right to know on something that we paid for, that what you wrote on something that we paid for that is of interest to us, the American people. Now, what do these new diary entries state? It shows, once again, as I've showed many times over the years covering this case, that Dr. Fauci has constantly contradicted himself. In his own diary, he says, now we know the wet market was not the source, it was the amplifier. Now, why is that important? Because Fauci went to the public and said that he knew for certain, and that there was a general consensus in science that what we called the Chinese coronavirus at first, we ended up calling COVID-19, was that it was from a wet market and not from a lab leak. But now we can hear Fauci say that in early 2020, in his diary, he says that the wet market was off the table. The day after writing in his diary that he knew that the wet market was not the source of COVID, he went on TV and said this.
And now in the novel coronavirus, we don't know exactly what that animal was, but some animal, probably in a wet market, where they bring in a variety of different types of wild game, and people sacrifice them, particularly around holidays like the Lunar New Year. It is totally not surprising that you're seeing the facilitation of this jump from the animal species to the human.
So now we know, again, this was the day after he wrote in his diary that he knew that the wet market was not the source, but basically an amplifier. We knew that he knew that that was BS, that it did not come from a wet market. A few days after that, he makes an entry where he says that there are now conspiracies that the virus was given gain of function via inserted mutations and released in Wuhan. The day after that, in February 1st, he has a secret call. Again, none of this was disclosed to any of us, the American public, who he was, assuring everything was okay. That the leading virologist, 10 of the top 12, did not believe in the natural origin hypothesis. Only 2 of them did. Only 2 of them. The overwhelming majority of the top virologists believed that it was a lab leak. But when he went to us, he told us that, hey, there's a scientific consensus that it came from this wet market in Wuhan. So he actually got one of the few scientists that did believe that it was of natural origin to draft a paper called Proximal Origin, and then they had that published in a leading medical magazine. So then he uses that as the basis to come to the American public in February and March of 2020 and say, hey, independent scientific research has now said that this has come from a wet market due to zoonotic transmission, not from the Wuhan lab, even though we are funding gain of function research into coronaviruses, bat coronaviruses, at the institution of Wuhan. Now, why would he do this? Again, they were funding through Dr. Ralph Barrick gain of function research at Wuhan of bat coronaviruses. There's been many reports of people who worked at the Wuhan Institute of Virology coming down with some mysterious illness and falling sick and dying. One of the people, the scientists' wives, died from COVID after it somehow escaped the lab. Now, again, that allows, at this point, that allows Fauci to cover this whole thing up. That's, at least it appears to be, a significant reason why he would just not be forthcoming about this. And it's important that we understand that Wuhan Institute of Virology is not the only place that we are funding with our government these types of bioweapons. No, we have bioweapons labs all over the world. We do. Our State Department, Victoria Nuland, lied and said, "Oh no, we don't have bioweapons labs in Ukraine." And then as soon as Putin invaded, they went, "Oh my God, he's going to get the bioweapons that we have in Ukraine." So I mean, this is going on. Fort Detrick is another place. Another one of the theories is that COVID actually came from Fort Detrick, and that the whole Wuhan thing is a distraction from the fact that it came from Fort Detrick. I don't know about that, because I mean, why would all those Chinese people die first? Like, whatever happened, the pandemic starts in China. At least when you start seeing mass deaths, you start seeing them in China before anywhere else. Another one of the big consequences of this whole debacle was the school closures. The school closures. That was actually one of the things I personally supported. You know, I got this wrong. I think me and the Rev argued about this when the Rev was still here, about the school closures. I was totally freaked out by the pandemic. I couldn't imagine letting kids be exposed to this virus. And so I thought, okay, we got to close all the schools. We got to lock everything down and lock all the kids down. That turned out to be the wrong perspective to take. Now that we've seen countries like Sweden. Sweden has the lowest COVID fatality rate in all of Europe. They never closed their schools. They didn't lose any. They lost virtually no kids to COVID. And we saw that kids were basically unaffected. Most children were unaffected by COVID. But what we did see in this country is that test scores have never recovered from the pandemic. There's an entire generation of kids who have been functionally, their progress in learning has been retarded by the school closures and the disturbance of their routine. We saw drug use skyrocket during the pandemic. For I think for 5 years straight, from I believe 2020 to 2024, 4 years, we saw a record number of drug deaths in America. We saw a rise in alcohol abuse. I did not believe that the American public would react so terribly to the lockdowns as we did, but apparently we did. And there were some people who were right about all of it. I did not see it. I just thought, hey, we have cell phones now. We have laptop computers now. It'll just be like chilling at the house. It'll be just like having a day off from work. I did not really understand the level of disturbance that we would see to all of our regular lives with these lockdowns. I'm sorry, I just didn't. I thought people would be fine. I thought people would watch Netflix and they would call their friends and families on Zoom calls and FaceTime. I thought they'd FaceTime their friends and family. I thought people would be fine. They weren't. We saw record numbers of drug deaths, alcohol deaths, suicide and self-harm. Young people have never recovered. Zoom school was an absolute disaster. In these diaries, we see also that Fauci says that he actually got the mayor of New York City at the time, Bill de Blasio, to close the schools. And he was the one who got California to close the schools. But in 2022, in an NBC News interview, he said, I had nothing to do with school closures, when conservatives were blaming him for the different school closures. So that's just a bald-faced lie that he was caught in. In these emails, he tells Francis Collins, for example, to please delete his emails after you read this, which is obviously against the law. Because we need to preserve all these records. That's why we give these people these devices, so we can preserve records for Congress and for FOIA and for future historians. He basically said that we don't do gain of function research, which was a lie. He lied about ivermectin and said that it didn't work, so that the government could basically force this, experimental gene therapy on the public. But now you have 100 studies involving over 200,000 people, 200,000 people that show that ivermectin reduced mortality by 47%, reduced hospitalization by 34%, reduced cases by 79%, increased viral clearance by 44%, and improved recovery by 39%. I still hear people all the time, even on this station, who watch the liberal media, the corporate liberal media, call ivermectin horse paste. Horse paste. Ivermectin is a Nobel Prize winning medication. The men who developed it, Satoshi Omura, William Coleman, they won the Nobel Prize for medicine because of ivermectin. They treated river blindness in Africa and cured a bunch of young people in Africa. People, not horses. Look this up, please. Now, if you want to argue that you don't believe ivermectin works in conjunction with COVID, fine. That's, you know, everybody should be looking these things up and doing their own research. But to call it horse paste is just a blatant lie. And the fact that people keep doing it in spite of knowing we are talking about a Nobel Prize winning medication. The people who developed it won Nobel prizes for treating human beings with it, speaks to a deliberate smearing and slandering of a Nobel Prize winning medication. And of course, you know, this again, we go back to the political wars, the culture wars, that, you know, everything is about what the Democrats support or what the Republicans support. And so when Dr. Fauci was developing this type of egomania, because Republicans were attacking him, Democrats were letting him get away with saying stuff like, I am science. How in the hell are you science? One man can't be science. Liberals named their kids and their dogs after him. They turned him into a celebrity. He talks about that in his emails, how cool it is, that Oprah and all these people fawn all over him. We learned that they completely made up the social distancing rules. We were all told we had to stay 6 feet away from each other. That was not based on any science whatsoever. That was a completely made up number. We know that he lied about masks not working, and then he said they didn't work, and then he said they do work, and then not working again. And for that, Joe Biden gave him a full and unconditional pardon for all crimes committed against the United States between 2014 and 2025, which says a lot because that's when a lot of the gain of function research was happening in places like Wuhan and Ukraine and all these other things. So, yeah. But there was a lot of carnage from all of this. There were real consequences. You had many doctors around the country, medical doctors who were dealing directly with patients, who were told that if they contradicted anything Dr. Fauci said and the CDC said, that they would have their medical license stripped from them. You saw, and I actually suffered from this on Twitter and in social media, you had anybody who was critical of things Dr. Fauci said or things that the CDC said. You had your accounts taken away. You had bans, cancellations. And then you learned that Dr. Fauci's daughter, Allison Fauci, worked for Twitter and was a part of the social media infrastructure to silence anybody who questioned her father. Again, that's not free speech. This is America. People can be wrong in a free country. If you think people are wrong, argue that they're wrong. It's a free country. You get to be wrong. But the cure for that is more speech, not silencing speech. And so this whole thing has shown the danger of cultish politics here in America. Leave whatever cult you're in. Leave the Democrat cult. Leave the Republican cult, the liberal cult, the conservative cult. Be a human being. Think for yourself. Don't trust the corporate media that's owned by the billionaire class and funded by Big Pharma, who made all the money off this. Oh, before yeah, I wanted to play this. Before I go to break, I wanted to play the people from Pfizer, the Pfizer executives talking about just how much they were going to profit off of this pandemic, just to show you what their motive was. Their motive was never about healing or protecting anybody. It was solely a financial endeavor for Albert Bourla and these types of people.
And, not as, so we don't see this as a one-time event, but we see this as something that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. Now, in terms of pricing, let me see if I can hit on that. So if you look at how current demand and current pricing is being driven, it's clearly not being driven by what I'll call normal market conditions, normal market forces. It's really been driven by kind of the pandemic state that we've been in and the needs of governments to really secure doses from the various vaccine suppliers. So what I believe is we move from a pandemic state, from a pandemic situation to an endemic situation. Normal market forces, normal market conditions will start to kick in. And factors like efficacy, booster ability, clinical utility will, basically become very important. And we view that as, quite frankly, a significant opportunity for our vaccine from a demand perspective, from a pricing perspective, given the clinical profile of our vaccine. So clearly, more to come here, but we think as this shifts from pandemic to endemic, we think there's an opportunity here.
There you go. As we shift from pandemic to endemic, we're going to make a hell of a lot of money. That's your guys from Pfizer. All right, folks, when we come back, the Happy Happies, please stay with us here on Straight Outta Cannon. We'll be right back after these.